Okay, thank you all for being here today. You're all experts in women's health and how we use clinical data to advance that objective. And I just wanted to start today, if each of you can tell us just a little bit about yourself, your background, your company, why you're doing the work that you're doing, what inspires you. I think that would be a good background for everybody. So Lyndsey, maybe let's start with you.
Sure thing. Thanks so much, Rachel. I'm Lyndsey Harper. I'm an OBGYN in Dallas, Texas, and I'm the founder of a company called Rosy. Rosy focuses on women's sexual health, which is why I get out of bed every single day because I'm super passionate about it. In my practice, I had patients coming to me every single day with sexual health questions and concerns. And unfortunately, in my training as a women's health expert, I received really zero information about how to help my patients with sexual health concerns, even though I spent 2 weeks in an erectile dysfunction clinic at the VA, a government funded institution. And so it really highlighted to me at the time just how the discrepancy, obviously, between the two genders when it comes to sexual health and care for sexual health, but also the fact that I, as a physician, didn't even realize that there was a gap in my training. I didn't even realize it until I was in front of patients without the answers that they needed. And I think that really highlighted for me just how many gaps there are for us as women that we may not be aware of, that certainly the general population isn't aware of. And what are the downstream effects for that every day, every hour, every minute for each of us? And so I'm super passionate about innovation in women's health, and also very passionate that innovation has to be really supported by the research and the data necessary to help us make the progress that women deserve. So really happy to be here.
Great. Thank you for being here with us. And thank you for that. Sipra, let's move it on over to you.
Sure. Really happy to be here. And thanks for moderating, Rachel. So my background is that I'm a reproductive psychiatrist based out of Atlanta, Georgia, and started LunaJoy Health about 2 years ago for lots of reasons. So as a perinatal reproductive psychiatrist, I've worked really closely with women clinically for about 7 years, taking care of women who were pregnant, postpartum, experiencing infertility, and recognizing that there's a huge mental health journey that often goes along with that. And then also seeing the same consistent holes in care, which is that women were sometimes getting screened, sometimes inconsistently, even if they were screening positive. A lot of learned helplessness in the medical system around mental health disorders. Often those referrals weren't even taking place. If those referrals did take place, they weren't landing. And so a lot of the statistics that we have around maternal mental health and perinatal mood disorders is that it's a growing problem. It's getting worse. And that 85% of women who are experiencing this are getting no treatment at all. And so seeing that consistently day after day with patients who were arriving at my doorstep 6 months too late, a year later, 3 years later, sometimes 5 to 7 years later, with mood disorders that emerged during pregnancy and postpartum that had just shifted then into not gone away, as most people usually think that happens, but just shifted into anxiety, depression, really understanding that not just on that mom, but on the entire family unit, that there's huge long-term repercussions to not treating. The other side of that coin is I'm a mom myself, and I have 4 kiddos. I had a set of twins during my last year of residency where I was getting my perinatal specialization. And I myself had pretty severe postpartum anxiety. And as a fully trained reproductive psychiatrist, where all my friends were psychiatrists, everyone in my family is a physician, I had a really hard time figuring out how to get myself help, how to get care. And that was 8 years ago. My twin boys just turned 9 last week. And I realized that this problem hasn't changed. We don't necessarily have better solutions. And so in the middle of the pandemic, just started getting to work, decided we needed a more scaled solution that was specifically addressing women's mental health, especially during these vulnerable life transitions. And this generalist model that we have around mental health care does not often fit women. Women are not just different men. And, I think the biggest thing that we've seen is if we are not asking, then we are not collecting data. What we're not collecting, what we're not measuring, we're not treating. And so huge hole too in the area of clinical research around women, mental health struggles, vulnerable life transitions, because until recently, we weren't even consistently asking. And so a lot of work, a lot of good work needs to be done.
Thank you. Jessica.
Yeah, thanks so much. My name is Jessica Thurmond. I'm based in Nashville, Tennessee, and I'm the co-founder of Athelo Health. I come at this from a kind of a different lens, so I think this is going to be a really fun conversation today. For me, my background educationally is in neuroscience. I made my way, so I worked in clinical trials for over 10 years. I worked site side, so academic, working with patients all the way to contract research, as well as working directly for pharmaceutical companies. And, during that time, I think what was so interesting to me is, I've seen so many different lenses of how trials run. And what's a bit frustrating for me is, right, like there's a ton of investment going into therapeutics. The patient experience hasn't really improved that much. And I think for me, one of the issues I see so much with drug development and the way we run our clinical research is that the implications is it's not just the drug, right? It's not just the drug that patients get. There's a downstream effect of how we come up with our treatment protocols, how we are diagnosing patients. And the clinical research all impacts that. So, I actually made my segue from the pharma industry for that reason to working, providing wraparound support for women who are experiencing a diagnosis of cancer. I see that in just even the lack of representation in the research that we do for cancer patients, not only for women, but for underserved and minority communities who are not included in the majority of our clinical research. And then for me personally, my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer when she was in her 30s. She came from a poor background. So she was from the Wapton Oyate Sioux tribe, which is a small sub-tribe of the Greater Sioux Nation in South Dakota, and really saw how lack of access to education and resources really negatively impacted her journey. And she passed when I was 13. But now, further on in life, we see that it's still a problem. And if nothing else, it's gotten more complicated. And we as a medical community need to do a better job about, making sure that a patient doesn't need a medical degree just to be able to understand their care pathway and their options. So really excited to be here today and be here with all these wonderful women making a difference.
Thank you so much. And thank you all. Well, then let's get into it. So we are here celebrating the 30th anniversary of the NIH Revitalization Act of 1993. Part of why I'm so excited about that is that before coming to Epstein-Barr, and actually before law school, I worked for Senator Barbara Mikulski from Maryland, who was a fierce advocate and marched down to NIH with her fellow women senators to demand that women and minorities be included in trials, because she knew what Sipra just said, that these trials were being done on, the average white, average weight, average age man, and then just being, saying like women are just smaller men. And that happens elsewhere. That happens with cars and car accidents. And it happens with like our military equipment. And like, it's been a problem with bringing women into the military. But today we are talking about women's health. And so I want to stay on topic. But obviously 30 years is a long time. We've made a lot of progress in that time, but I'm a millennial. I'm a little impatient, and I feel like that's something we all have in common. And we're really trying to address not just in government, but outside of government. And so, Jessica, maybe let's start with you. Like, you spent so much of your career working in clinical research, as you just said. So maybe you can give us some examples of like where there are real gaps, like where you've seen gaps, and how that's impacted your work at Athelo and like your mission.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm a huge research nerd, so not everyone finds all of this fascinating. I oddly do. One of the things that strikes me is just the way that our drug development has been set up from the ground up. So things always start in preclinical models. So this is when you're typically people are testing on mice and rats. And it's so interesting to me that for the most part, the majority of the labs typically or historically have only used male rats. They have not used female rats. And the reason for that is because the female rats tend to urinate more. So it creates more of an odor in the labs. And so it is strictly a matter of convenience for the people who are working in the lab who don't want to deal with that. It's more of a mess to clean up. But if you think about it, if that's the very basis of how we're starting to test our drugs, is on a male anatomy of a male rat, then from the get-go, we're not set up to succeed for a woman's body. We know that women's bodies have a different distribution from fat. Their hormonal cycles are on a 24-hour cycle versus men. And so, physiologically, there are differences. And that's not just women, that's also different racial and ethnic minorities. Bodies just respond differently. And it's really been interesting to me. I mean, I work in the cancer care space, but across the full spectrum. I mean, there was a review from 2001 to 2010 done some years ago. And of all the drugs that were on the market and all the studies that were assessed for drugs that were currently available, 60% of the participants were 60% were men and 80% were white who were on those studies. And there's so many things. So, I mean, there's a term that has come about called bikini medicine. And I think, a lot of people talk about this, where that women for a long time were perceived as only being different from men in terms of their reproductive capabilities. And so historically, that was utilized as an excuse in some cases to not include women, of saying, oh, well, there could be, long-term reproductive implications that we don't understand. It could, if they become pregnant while they're on the study, we don't know how that could potentially impact the fetus and the child. And that's all well and good. But then there are absurd examples that just really blow my mind. In 1986, there was an NIH funded study that was put on. It was a pilot through Rockefeller University. And they were studying how obesity impacts outcomes in breast and gynecologic cancer patients, or uterine cancer in this particular case. And what's crazy to me is that they did not enroll a single woman on that study. And they were studying obesity and breast and uterine cancer. So I would love to know how they made any rationale. I mean, certainly men can have breast cancer. But I mean, this was published. These were peer-reviewed articles. And even with, the introduction of the Revitalization Act, one thing that people have to be aware of is I think as a medical community, we need to hold ourselves to higher standards, because not every study is funded by NIH. In fact, a lot of them aren't, and especially when it comes to drug development. And so while these requirements that are in place obviously are required for NIH-funded studies, that doesn't mean that every study has that same expectation. And to this day, there are many drugs that we don't compare men and women. We don't do, maybe there's a sub-analysis, but if you think of an early phase study on a new drug, you may only have 12 to 30 patients tops on that. So statistically, it's really hard to compare a very small group. So, I mean, it's just from the full spectrum. And like we were saying, I know that, obviously Lyndsey and Sipra can talk more to this, but the impacts that it has on treatment regimens, the way that we're dosing patients. Ambien was a great example of that, where women were found to have significantly higher risk. I mean, they were dying as a result of side effects of Ambien. We know for cancer drugs that women are at a significantly higher risk of severe hospitalization side effects for not only chemotherapy, but targeted therapies and immunotherapies, every drug we could give you. And I think that's what was my impetus for moving into the space of Athelo. We already know that the system and the way that we've developed drugs is kind of rigged against women in some ways. So how do we combat that from a real world evidence perspective in the real world where medicine is being practiced, and not just in large academic institutions? And I think, all the women here are doing great work to support, because it's really critical that, knowledge is power, and just knowing that you are at a greater risk can really, impact your life or death, and being able to advocate for your medical care.
Thank you so much. Sipra, I really appreciated that you shared your personal story, so I'm going to follow suit. I am about 4 months pregnant with my first child. I'm having a baby girl in December. And as Priya outlined before, it's a very weird time to be a pregnant woman in the United States and to be bringing a girl into this world. But I remain hopeful and optimistic. And I know that in your practice, we see so many women, especially at this stage of, being a woman, their fertile years when they're having babies, they face mental health conditions related to pregnancy, trying to conceive, postpartum. So where are some gaps related to maternal mental health research? And how has that impacted your research at LunaJoy and your work?
Congratulations on the pregnancy.
Thank you.
That's very exciting. So in terms of thinking about gaps for maternal mental health research, I would say it's more gaps than it is knowledge. This is really an area that we've only recently started to look much more closely at. And that is problematic for a number of reasons. One, in order to get insurance payers and things like that on board with providing treatment and being aggressive about providing treatment, and even kind of looking into like risk and calculating that risk and getting people the services they need in real time, you need data, right? There needs to be like a clinical case around it, and then there needs to be a business case around it. And because we haven't had this data, we haven't looked closely at this data, that's a big hole that's missing, on the mental health side. And I think if I'm a psychiatrist, I really like to understand motivation and behaviors. And so if we take even like a step back and a step further, we can think about mental health issues and even the word hysteria, which actually means in Greek and Latin, right, the uterus. So there has been this dismissal of mental health symptoms that are just understood to be inherently female in some way, if we even think about kind of the basis of that word. And then the other assumption that's really been made is that these things are non-consequential, right? So I talk all the time about the normalized suffering for women, right? This is an area that not only governs like clinically what we do, but really governs research, where our research dollar goes, where our funding dollars go, because for a long time, it has been believed that women suffering through these vulnerable life transitions, whether it's pregnancy, postpartum, perimenopause is another big area, that it's kind of inconsequential, that it's time limited, that hopefully it will just go away, and there must not be kind of anything more to do about it. And I think with a lot of those assumptions, that has guided how we collect data, that is really guided whether we're even looking at the data. And forgetting about the studies for a second, if we just look clinically, even though we have these ACOG recommendations around doing perinatal mood and anxiety screens at that first visit, and now, every trimester during pregnancy, including postpartum, still screenings aren't even being regularly done. So we are such a far step away from having all the data that we need in terms of research. Right now, we're just like struggling to meet kind of some basic requirements around standard of care. A lot of work to be done in the area. And I think that I've seen even in the last year, such a huge shift around the thinking, which is that, this does matter. This is related to inflammation. It's related to preterm births. It's related to IUGR, that women not feeling well during pregnancy and postpartum has absolutely measurable health outcomes that matter from a business perspective, that matter from a clinical and health perspective, that really do matter and have long-term consequences associated with them.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not someone who suffers quietly, and I have noticed that it is expected of pregnant women to be, ebullient and very happy and not in pain and not suffering. And people are a little surprised when I admit that I'm maybe not feeling well today. And it's really an understudied area. And all I hear is when I'm looking for information is that, well, we don't want to study it, women who are pregnant. And I'm like, well, then how are we ever going to get information? So you're definitely in a space where we need a lot more research. And I think the only space that has less research than that is where Lyndsey is with women's sexual health. And my understanding is the data set you've developed through Rosy is likely the largest in the field of women's sexual health. And I just want you to speak a little bit why this is so important and what gaps that you see and maybe how you think we can best fill them.
Yeah, I mean, just like Sipra was saying, like we know less than we don't know at this point, and that's kind of where we have to start. We have to start somewhere, and that's okay. I think I agree with so much of what was said, which is, we suffer in silence throughout so much of our lives. We're socially sort of habituated in that way when we're brought up. Beauty is pain and Eve's curse, and like all of these narratives that we sort of proudly take on to show up as sort of strong and independent, determined women, right? So at the same time we're suffering, we're also sort of pushing that back and down in order to project something differently to achieve the goals that we have for ourselves in our life. And so what happens as a result of that silence is that people don't know that 43% of women have a sexual health concern. That's almost half of women, right? And historically, because, and I mean, we have men on our team. I'm definitely more of the ally sort of situation, but I think we can look back and understand how if men are in charge of making the research decisions and building medicine as we know it and training the trainees, that you would view it through a male lens. I mean, I don't think that there's any really difficulty understanding that. And so with that, women's sexual health has become viewed as a function of reproduction and a function of male pleasure. And because of that, no one cares if women want sex, if women enjoy sex, if women are having sexual problems, unless it affects, one of these other things. And just like Sipra was just saying, we find ourselves justifying our existence by saying, oh, well, it affects, XYZ productivity, or look at this effect that it has on the family, or look at these other, related health effects that you already care about, and having to, really tie it to a post. But they didn't do that for Viagra. They just didn't. And there are 26 FDA approved medications for men's sexual problems. There are 2 for women, neither of which are covered by insurance regularly. And it's just kind of beyond belief that we are where we are. But that's the first step, really, to taking action, is really understanding what the landscape is. And I think, since I've started doing this 4 years ago, women's sexual health wasn't part of a conversation. We weren't part of these panels. We weren't talked about as a larger piece of women's health. And so that I can look now and see that progress has been made. And so the next job of ours is to, take this data set, which, I mean, I would love to hear if anyone has a larger data set. We have about 280,000 women who have been on the platform. So, and we understand, and it's all de-identified, by the way, in case we want to get into privacy things. But so we can really take a look at, what are the tangential effects and also, co-contributors to sexual health problems. How can we extrapolate that to what we know about infertility, to what we know about pregnancy, postpartum, menopause, cancer, all of these different women's health life events? And, sexual health, I love because it's with us our whole entire lives, right? We don't go through a sexual health phase of life. We go through many iterations of sexual health, and it's a constant navigation. And, there's so much work to be done to get on par with what's known in men's sexual health, but really to make the conversation more robust for all genders. It's really a multidisciplinary experience, including medicine, including mental health, including, the understanding what's going on in the person's sort of cultural and relationship dynamics. Which I think is beautiful. And I think how healthcare, should be reinvented in this next iteration. And we have the ability to do that now, with big data and all of these learnings that so many of our companies are going through. So it's inspiring, to see so many people working on it at the same time. And it's about time, because there's so much work, for all of us to do as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Yeah, sexual health is with us our whole lives, and it's so taboo, and it's really wrapped around reproduction, and that's only such a small part of our life. And I really appreciate what you said about that. So I want to make this really clear for the women and men who are here tonight. I know we have at least 2 men, because my dad and Priya's dad are on, but I'm sure we have more men, because really, women's health needs to be a male priority too, right? This is how we make progress. And I worked for 2 great appropriators, Senator Mikulski, as I mentioned, in the Senate, and Steny Hoyer from Maryland in the House. And, his allyship for focusing on this kind of funding, focusing on clinical research, and other men in Congress. When the Revitalization Act passed, there weren't that many women in Congress. The year of the women wasn't until 1994. So we need our male allies. And so to make it clear to both the men and women in the audience, while clinical research can seem very far away, and for people like all of us who are kind of in it every day and focus on it, what can the people who are here today, maybe this is the first time they're thinking about clinical research, maybe this is the first time that they're thinking about how this impacts our daily lives and how it impacts our daily decisions, what can they do to kind of take this back with them and kind of make progress in their lives and advocate for better clinical research and access? And I'll leave that open to whoever wants to go first. Lyndsey.
I'll take it. Just to start, at least. Something that I think about a lot is where we think women's health should be, the needs of each of us as individual women, and what our physicians and the medical community can do for us today, right? We know, we can see, we feel every time we, search something or go to our doctor with a question, the giant gap that exists, right? For people who are feeling terribly during pregnancy, why do we have just 2 drugs that don't really work that well, right? For mental health problems postpartum, why are we not able to accurately diagnose and define and get women to the care that they need appropriately? Why in women's sexual health do so many women go unserved for decades, right? And the reason for that gap is research. Right? We want to do better as doctors and as a medical system, and we need better and are demanding better as healthcare consumers. The gap is the research, right? And so without this, we're not going to be able to make the progress that we want. We're going to see consumer-facing media and marketing spinouts that are going to be fast to fail because they don't have the data that they need to support them long-term. And we're going to see physicians and patients just growing further and further apart, because that consumer demand is driving the conversation, but the medical community isn't going to be able to meet it. So this is imperative to the future of women's health that we get this funded. And it's my feeling that this has to start, in Washington, D.C., because without the proper funding for women's health generally, if we get into a whole nother conversation about reimbursement, where the dollars are, the dollars will follow, right? So if we're not getting reimbursed adequately for women's health conditions, no one's going to be interested in innovating. No one's going to be interested in investing. So it really has to start there. And as much as I want to avoid all of that as long as possible, it's coming at us all imminently who are passionate about this, because there's just no avoiding the reimbursement problems in women's health. So I would say, if you're looking for something to do, lobby your politicians to support and advocate for better reimbursement in women's health, and the dollars will follow.
Yeah, I take yes, politics. Anything that changes in our medical field typically starts in Washington. It starts with policy. That's just the reality of it. Like Lyndsey was saying, even down to the codes that are billable. And the thing that's crazy too is there are a lot of these codes that exist, and they change every year. And a lot of them aren't used, even if they do exist, for a variety of reasons. I think the other part is I think about the individual too, of, I don't think that clinical trials and clinical research are that distant. We just have been in a global pandemic for years. When vaccines were being developed on the spot, it was crazy. I worked on some of those vaccine studies at the time, and we were working 100 hours a week just to try to get things going as quickly as possible. And I think it's important for people, to be aware of what the clinical trial process is, to be active consumers of information around the drugs that are out there, the care they receive, and also volunteer for one of these trials. I've been on many trials myself and research. There are local academic institutions. You can just sign up for a mailing list and they'll let you know whenever research is going on. Some of them may even just need healthy volunteers. They don't always test drugs on you. But all of these things are so important. And when you see, I think the flip side of this is to educate yourself on data privacy as well, because, I know for all of us who are aggregating large data sets, we as innovators want to protect our end users and our patients as much as possible. The tech companies, for the most part, that you see that are working within this space are going above and beyond because we want people to feel confident in the product that they're using and that their information is going to be safe. And I truly think that at the very basis of all of this, it comes down to trust. The reason that marginalized communities have not been a large part of clinical trials or research in general is not unfounded. It's really valid. And I think that for some of us, it's our job to expand that knowledge and to reach out to people and to help community, but it's also to really fuel a sense of trust and transparency. And that's not just a call of action for the everyday person. That's up for other female founders and other founders in general. A lot of this change starts with us. And even if I'm not the one to make the changes, then we're laying the way for future generations of people who are going to be innovating in this space. And, it stings to think that as women, we have to continually hold ourselves to the highest standards, but it's the truth. And at the end of the day, we all want to help people. And I think it's good for people to ask questions. Ask questions. You're not going to look stupid. Like Lyndsey and Sipra have said, your doctors want to help you. They want to give you answers. And the consumer demand is the other way that we can fuel change. If you are going to your doctors and saying, how come I don't have access to Rosy? How come I don't have access to LunaJoy? Why don't I have Athelo as an option for me? That is the only way, as well as consumers, that we can impact change. And I think it's just really valuable for everyone to be an active consumer of your own data.
Thank you so much. So I have to do a quick plug just because, it's my job, but anybody looking for help with coding, coverage, or privacy, give me a call. That's what we do at Epstein Becker Green. Sipra, I'm going to give you the last word and then we're going to head back to Priya.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add, I think that it's all mostly been said. Going back to the kind of consumer, I think the fundamental underlying thing with all of this is just to challenge the status quo. I know that all of the work that we've done at LunaJoy and almost every single thing that we've been built has been built off of patient needs, patient stories, things that we have seen like on the ground happening with people in real life. And so being an active consumer is really important. And I think even challenging the status quo. So when you go in to your appointments, ask for more explanations, understand why things may or may not be happening. If you aren't feeling well, even if, you feel like you don't want to say anything because it's expected that you grin and bear a pregnancy and, deal with whatever anxiety you're having, talk about these things, talk about them with your friends, talk about them with your medical providers. Just getting more of this out in conversation raises awareness, and it raises like pathways upon which other people can build, whether it's solutions or clinical research or thinking about things more deeply. But I think the fundamental idea of challenging the status quo, especially in women's health, is really kind of powerful and at the basis of what we all have.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being with us today and for the extraordinary work that you're doing for advancing women's health. And I'll turn it back over to Priya.